Hello, welcome back. My name is Julian Frazier, and I am your fitness psychologist. Today, I have a treat for you. They didn't make a much fanfare about this, but they actually released the dietary guidelines for Americans, 2020 to 2025 edition, which is the latest update, a few weeks ago, actually. And so, I guess that's a little confusing because it's 2021, and uh, I guess because of the pandemic, we can cut them some slack for being about a year late with the every 5-year update to these dietary guidelines. But today I'm going to go over my top 5 problems with the dietary guidelines. So I've been able to get my hands on a PDF. They're free online. You can Google it, get your own, skim through it yourself, kind of come to your own conclusions. But there's a few things that obviously stand out as, not being completely in line with the science, completely in line with what is most healthy if you were thinking about guidelines or recommendations for folks. I think in general, it does a decent job of saying, hey, if your alternative is the standard American diet, the SAD diet, which is mostly processed foods, junk foods, sugary fat foods, those sorts of things, then this is likely some recommendations which are better than that. And so, if you follow the American guidelines, you'd probably be okay, but we're not here to aim for okay. We're here to give the best available information. And as we skim through this, we'll see that there's actually some problems in my mind and inconsistencies. And so I'm going to go back and forth between my slides here, and it's very simple, and the guidelines themselves. Again, you can find them yourself online. They're PDF form, they're .gov document, very easy to find. And so problem number 1 for me is this continued ban on saturated fats. And there are more than one documentary, more than one book, a lot of different sources, which kind of outline the history of how we've come to demonize fat and subsequently replace fat in the diet with sugar, dating back to the 70s. I'll leave a few links below to TED Talks or the sources, kind of detailing this if you're interested in that history. But ever since they started coming out with these dietary guidelines, they have given some restrictions on fat consumption, saturated fat. Trans fat is one thing that we can say with some certainty is not good for us, but they've always been banning cholesterol. In fact, about 10 years ago, or more, they'd likely be saying that we shouldn't have avocados at all because of so much fat in an avocado. And yet nowadays we can't get enough avocados, right? And so this whole idea of saturated fat being bad for us and cholesterol seems to have very little support in the literature itself. When we look at it, I mean, it's mixed at best. And I think that you could find that the consensus is that there are definitely forms of fat which are better than saturated fat, like the kinds of fat that you'll find in fish, like you'll find in avocados, but that it's likely net neutral for our diet. And so let's actually take a look at the guidelines themselves. And this is actually one of the first times where we see like that same inconsistency, right? So what it highlights is that we should have as little cholesterol in our diet, and it lumps dietary cholesterol and trans fats together, which is confusing to me. I think that they're kind of like two completely different categories. In my mind, at least, that trans fats seems pretty sound in terms of the data that we should exclude it from our diet to the best of our ability. But there's different forms of cholesterol, so lumping them together seems odd. But what's interesting is that throughout this entire document, there's a lot of information that points to eating eggs, right? And if you look at the dietary information about eggs, it looks like you have like 2 eggs as you're already capping out your daily cholesterol intake. So basically, it's on one hand saying that we shouldn't have cholesterol or have as little as possible, and on the other, it's saying that we should have eggs as part of our diet, and that's confusing to me. But here's when I was like trying to make sense of why this artifact continues to come up every 5 years, in spite of the fact that the evidence doesn't necessarily show that we should be looking at a kind of a blanket statement about saturated fat cholesterol, is look at this image here. So the top sources of average intake of saturated fat for the US population ages 1 and older. And this is, that's a piece that's confusing to me as well. But it looks like the saturated fat intake is largely coming from two sources. Well, three sources. We can look at sandwiches, okay, desserts and sweet snacks. And you can see that 7% is rice, pastas, and other grain-based mixed dishes. The biggest chunk of this pie seems to be coming from other sources, but because we have very little like of a paper trail in terms of the sources that they've used, we don't even have an idea what that other sources is. And so they actually take the desserts and sweet snacks and divide them up into some subcategories here. And you can see that with sandwiches, they're looking at burgers, they're looking at tacos, right? A taco, I don't think of as a sandwich, but here we go. Breakfast sandwiches, all these things wrapped up. And then other sandwiches is interesting. But this is 19% thinking of ages 1 and above. And I'm scratching my head thinking, how many 1-year-olds are out there like throwing down tacos and sandwiches? I bet if you took this and chunked it up by age, that when we're looking at adults, these figures are much, much higher. And when we look at the biggest slices of the pie for saturated fat, at least from what they've provided, what do they have in common? Well, they're likely very high in refined grains and carbohydrates. I mean, sandwiches are literally wedged between two pieces of bread. And I mean, desserts and sweet snacks obviously are very high in sugar as well. So there's some conflating factors in my mind that quickly come to mind whenever we're thinking about why are we trying to limit saturated fats when there's other things that it seems like we should be trying to limit in our diet based off of even just this image alone. Again, we don't have a paper trail as to how they put these numbers together. I think that if you went to the .gov, they might have some information kind of detailing their methodology. But from what I've seen, it is relatively vague. I think purposefully so. And here's what I'm thinking for these categories, especially that they're attempting to curb people away from junk food, fast food, those sorts of things. But because these are the American guidelines, it's like the main sources of saturated fat in the US diet include sandwiches, including burgers, tacos, burritos, desserts, etc. They can't come out and say that like you likely shouldn't have Taco Bell. Like Wendy's probably isn't the best for you. McDonald's may not be good for your health, right? But they can say that you should have less saturated fat. And it just so happens that junk foods, fast foods have a higher than average proportion of saturated fat. And so there's this politicking game that takes place where they can't come out and say that certain businesses, certain corporations and their products might be bad for you. Why? Well, because these are the American guidelines and many of those companies are American companies. But they can't say, you should have less saturated fat. And if people in general adhere to that idea, then they're likely to eat less fast food, junk food. What's also confusing to me, which we'll talk about later, above and beyond the problem with eggs, is that they also note that saturated fat is commonly found in high amounts in meats and dairy. So again, there's some conflicting interests here in my mind as I'm trying to wrap my head around, okay, what does that mean for us? So for each of these problems, I'm likely going to give my own solution. And, I'm working with the assumption here that that we're not just talking about saturated fats in general, in spite of the mixed evidence, but that they're trying to like curb people away from junk foods, fast foods, those sorts of things. And so by calling it all saturated fats, maybe they'll listen. Maybe folks will listen and eat less of those, poor quality foods. Now, the problem is is that in the past, when people have in fact listened to dietary guidelines and recommendations, which have happened, we told people to eat less fat and they ate less fat. And so these corporations, they can move pretty quick. They came out with entire brands that were low calorie, that were low fat, that were no fat in some cases, and instead replaced it with sugar and all kinds of other things. So I can't imagine a situation where folks start being counter saturated fat, and it doesn't somehow have an unintended consequences where the thing that they replace saturated fat with is somehow worse than the saturated fat itself. And so that's problem number one, is that they continue to bash saturated fat, cholesterol, all of these sources, in spite of saying that we should continue to have milk and eggs. I wish that we could just eat a little bit less fast food and junk food. And this is coming from someone who's like, I'm pretty sure that about a fifth, if not a fourth, of my meals come from convenient sources, right? So I'm not saying that these are entirely bad, that they should be demonized completely, but the fact that the recommendations and guidelines makes very little attempt to say that certain sources of food are likely to be worse for your health than others over time. It tells me that there might be some political interests there. And so that kind of floats into number two, and I already started alluding to this interesting idea about dairy. And so let's just jump back to the guidelines. And so here is a chart, and these charts can be pretty daunting. I think that they do make sense after you've taken a chance to really look through them. But if you just saw a page full of numbers and boxes, I can see a lot of folks, it just kind of goes over their head. And to be fair, a lot of these boxes go over my head. Now, because I only work with adults and the research that I've done has been only with adults, I'm myself only going to comment on adults. This entire guidelines goes through like prenatal through older adulthood. So it touches on each kind of chunk of human development. And I only am looking at the sliver, which is adults. But something stands out to me here when I look at this. And so this is each food group and kind of recommendations around what folks between the ages of 19 and 59 should be eating based off of different calorie levels, whatever that means. And so if your diet is typically around X number of calories, this is kind of the recommended breakdown of fruits and vegetables of different kinds, of meats of different kinds. And what stood out to me here is that, of course, with each, ascending caloric pattern, whatever that means, there is usually an ascending number of cup equivalents per day or per week of each of these food groups that they recommend. I think that there's seafood is one which goes up very slowly. Meat and poultry seem to go up relatively quickly. There's one which does not change at all, and that is dairy. And I think to myself, why do they want me to only have 3 cups equivalent of dairy per day? Well, and this is nothing new. This is how I guess milk and other dairy products have been marketed, that we should have 3 cups equivalent a day, like 1 with each meal. But I'm thinking, wouldn't it increase if my calories increased? If all of these other things seem to increase, why is this not increasing? And so I think on one hand, you can say that milk has a lot of stuff in it and it's often refined. And so maybe, the 3 cups that you get from milk meets all your needs no matter the caloric intake. So that's one potential argument that if this caloric level of pattern or whatever went up to 4,000, that maybe this would bump up to 4 cups at some point, right? To be a decent part of the ratio. Or maybe there's nothing in dairy necessarily which is essential, that you and I and everyone in the world could stop eating dairy tomorrow, replace it with something else, and we would likely be fine. And that instead, saying that we should have 3 servings or cup equivalents per day of dairy is a gentle nod to the dairy lobby and dairy industry that we should continue to use their products. Because I think that the dairy industry has been hurting, especially with the introduction of all other kinds of milks that they're somehow squeezing from oats and almonds and all those sorts of things. And so this inclusion of dairy from every 5-year increments to the next is just trying to keep the dairy industry afloat. And that's kind of what it feels like to me. It's interesting that they call it a food group, dairy a food group. Again, there's nothing in dairy that feels like it is necessary. Now, I don't know that I would make as big a stink about dairy being a part of the recommendations. In fact, that you should have 3 cup equivalents of dairy, one with each segment of your meal throughout the day, if it was entirely benign. But it does not seem as though that's the case. And so if I shift over here, I got this pulled up already, and this is a source from 2013, kind of showing the prevalence rates of lactose intolerance throughout the world. And so if we look globally, it looks like about 1/3 of adults kind of lack the necessary enzymes to break down lactose, which is the kind of sugar naturally present in most milks, dairy milks. From what I understand, when we're younger, we have more of this enzyme, and as we age, we make less and less of this enzyme as we depend less on milk for our sustenance. We're the only species that's kind of figured out how to take milk and squeeze it out of other animals and process it and sell it to humans. You can see that some of these prevalence rates are approaching, if not at 100%. So 100% of people who drink milk in certain regions of the world have some sort of GI distress or symptoms that might result from lactose intolerance. And that in other areas of the world, about 1/3 of folks seem to have some level of lactose intolerance. What's surprising to me is that there's a lot of places we have no data for at all. So it's hard to say. But when an entire continent seems to be at least 50% lactose intolerant, one must ask if there are any consequences for suggesting that all of the people, regardless of their ability to break down lactose, should have some kind of milk. And don't get me wrong, I know that they make products which are processed so that they no longer have the lactose in them. But then I'm saying, okay, what's the point? Why dairy? Why not look into fruits and vegetables or something like that? I think there's been some interesting arguments made about people of color being disproportionately impacted by lactose intolerance rates, as opposed to folks with maybe more European ancestry, whose ancestry was kind of grew up in herding cultures and were exposed to milk more often, and maybe have a genetic makeup which helps them to process that enzyme for longer. I just think that to recommend that everyone, no matter your size, no matter your situation, get 3 cups of dairy is irresponsible in some ways. But at the same time, there's a very powerful dairy lobby that is pushing this food group and hopes that, if all of us did in fact have 3 cup equivalents a day of dairy, that the dairy industry would continue to thrive. And that's milk, cheese, yogurt, eggs, excuse me. I was thinking ice cream and said eggs. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I love ice cream, but I know that ice cream is going to mess up my stomach. So take it for what it is. I don't think that dairy needs to be a part of these recommendations. If you have any sort of GI distress, GI being gastrointestinal, or any other signs of lactose intolerance, that you could cut dairy out of your diet and you'd be fine. That takes me... I'm going back and forth between sharing screens here. Problem number 3. So the recommendations for added sugar have been capped at 10% of your diet. And so I think I crunched a few of the numbers. And if you eat 2,000 calories a day and 10% of your diet is added sugar, then that means you can have a limit of 13 teaspoons of sugar, of just added sugar, not the sugar that's already in stuff, like naturally occurring sugars or sugars that just breaks down from grains or refined carbohydrates, but added sugar to your diet a day. And I think that in a lot of cases, this comes down to sugary drinks and, of course, snacks. I think folks are kind of aware that when they're eating candy that it involves sugar. But I have a gripe with this, and I have a gripe with carbohydrates in general. So I think what it does do is it does do a good job of trying to delineate between refined carbohydrates and whole grains. I think that when they talk about whole grains, they don't do a great job of really saying what that means or what that is. And so they leave enough gray area for it to be misunderstood. And so here's an interesting graph, which shows, the total vegetables, fruits, grains, dairies, protein foods that folks have per day. The kind of greenish, I have like aquamarine, like what is that color? Is kind of a recommended intake range for most folks. And the purple dot shows, based off of their data, kind of the average intakes. And so we can kind of tell that folks are getting fewer fruits and vegetables than likely they should. They seem to be exceeding on average. And this is for the ages 19 to 30. But if we scroll down for ages 31 to 59, it looks very similar, low on fruits and vegetables. We're killing it in the protein department. And you can see that it's mostly from meats. It seems like people are getting less dairy than they would like us to be getting on average. But also that the total grains seems to be falling within this recommended range, but towards the bottom end of this recommended range. So if you just looked at either of these graphs, and this one's a little bit more pronounced, but if you looked at either of these graphs, it would almost look like we need to eat less protein and more dairy, fruits, vegetables, and grains. They will say that we're meeting those recommendations, but what does meeting those recommendations look like? And so when you scroll down for the grains, it does have a second graph showing you the total number of grains. Again, here's the recommended zone. The purple is the average, and we look like we're just meeting the tip of the iceberg of that. But when they break it down into whole grains and refined grains, it looks like this average is actually an average of two extremes. So we're eating way too many refined grains. We're getting a few notches above the recommendation for refined grains and a few notches below whole grains. I like that they have this little picture over here of quinoa. Let me make sure that'll be which is a whole grain. And with some fruits and vegetables and some chicken and all those sorts of things. But they don't do a great job of, explaining what the difference is between whole grains and refined grains. And so this is actually, while it is accurate, it might be misleading because both, right, for 19 to 30 as well as 30 through 59, I think, that is the case. We're getting way too much refined grains and way too little whole grains. Now, if we look at a glycemic index, I don't have a chart pulled up, but the difference between sugars, added sugars, had a lot of things that burn up really quickly in our glycemic index, glycemic load, is almost indistinguishable from white bread and wheat bread. And so even if you were to say, go to the store, you look at this, say, okay, I need more whole grains. You go to the store, you look at the shelf, your options are wheat bread. It's slightly more brown and has little flakes of grains sprinkled on top, or white bread. And you say, I'm going to make a healthy option. I'm going to get the whole grain bread. right? Well, they don't say how much of the bread needs to be whole grain. In fact, the vast majority of it is still processed. And when you eat it, it is burned up in your body the same way as though it were white bread, right? The difference is negligible in terms of how your body handles it. And so when we think of these differences, well, first of all, the limit of 10% amount of total energy to added sugar, it looks like 2/3 of individuals seem to exceed that. That makes sense. But when we also think about these misleading charts about how we eat whole grains and refined grains, um, it leads us to think that we should have more grains, we should have fewer refined ones. But when we're looking for what whole grains means, that is also itself confusing. And so we end up with a large portion of our diet being a kind of refined grains, refined carbohydrates, without really being aware of it. And when they talk about whole grains, I think they are talking about the kinds of quinoas and the other things where what you're eating is merely the grain, merely the seed. It hasn't been pulverized into a flour and then baked into a different shape, like your pastas and a lot of your baked goods and pastries. So going back, that's kind of problem number 3 for me. It's again odd that they would say that cholesterol should be as low as possible, but added sugar should be no more than 10% of your diet. I think that if they wanted to, again, put forth guidelines and recommendations that were in the best interests of Americans, they would say that added sugar should be as low as plausible, right? That they should say lower is better. There's no reason that 10% of our diet should be added sugar. Again, this is sugar going above and beyond the sugar that's already inside of a lot of the fruits and vegetables that are processed in carbohydrates. And they need to do a better job of explaining what exactly a whole grain is. Those are sometimes the seeds, the grains that comes along with the fiber and the germs and those sorts of things. That is what happens when you have like a quinoa bowl or something like that. That is very different from whole grain bread, which is basically just bread with some, flakes of barley sprinkled on top, or oats or something like that. The problem remains the same. I think that we should have as little added sugar as plausible. I add sugar to stuff all the time. And that's to say that we likely all add sugar to stuff all the time and have things like soda. Not trying to demonize it necessarily, but if I was making recommendations or guidelines, I would say that less is more in this case. Problem number 4. And problem number 4 and 5 are a lot around the language that is used in the American guidelines. In fact, I'll just bounce over again. So as we kind of get into the section for adults here, the introduction to chapter 4 is for adults. I think it starts on page 92. Yeah. They kind of lead with this idea that like 74% of adults are either clinically overweight or obese, and that's based off of BMI standards. And yes, you can say that BMI is likely a shoddy way of estimating health and weight. And yeah, I think I appreciate that. And also, even just based off of BMI on large enough populations to say that around 3/4 of folks are either overweight or obese, is chin scratching. Now, what is frustrating from my perspective is I'll just read it out loud. Losing weight and maintaining weight loss is not a simple task. True. It requires adults to reduce the number of calories they get from foods and beverages and increase the amount of expended through physical activity. And this is kind of the part where I sigh, because this is just another iteration of that calories in, calories out, that your ability to moderate your metabolism and your weight is based merely on your ability to control the amount of calories that you put in. And increase the amount of calories that you burn. This is the same story that they've been telling folks for the past 20 plus years that has not been working. We've seen it over and over again, even in the most extreme situations, like The Biggest Loser. The vast majority of people who go out of their way to try to lose weight by using a calories in, calories out model fail 8 out of 10, right? And then so if this ethos is not working, I very much am concerned when we continue to try to screw in a screw by hitting it with a hammer. I think that if you know anything about me and anything about my work, that I am very anti-calorie because human beings don't eat calories. And so when you see these big charts about calories and based off of age and numbers, and you try to calculate it out, even if you did, who knows if that is necessarily representative of you? And most of the time when you eat whole foods, you're not sitting down with an app telling you how much your banana has in calories based off of its size and weight and all of those sorts of things. I think that it does more harm than good when we try to take food and reduce it to something which is purely quantitative, and then tell folks that in order for them to maintain their health, what they need to do is to become like food accountants for themselves and try to reduce everything that they eat to a certain number of calories and turn all forms of physical activity into calorie expending adventures. I just don't think that is an effective way to work with humans around their food. They do go on to say it's like they require a commitment to long-term lifestyle change and often need support from healthcare providers, family members, and social networks. Again, there seems to be something missing here, right? That yes, folks likely could use support from community, from family, from friends, and long-term lifestyle change, absolutely. But this puts all of the onus, all of the responsibility on the individual, which I guess in some sense makes sense when America is the most individualistic country in the world, according to some statistics. But something is missing here. And so when I look at, I don't know, it is conflicting information for me whenever we have these big graphs about all these calories and then try to divide it up by your activity level and try to estimate this. And oh, by the way, the caloric information in like the dietary informations on the back of your boxes, they can be like give or take 20%. Right. And so all of these things are just estimates. And when you break it down, it's not actually reflective of you and your needs and what is in your best interest. And so you can be doing your best to do all of the calorie accounting that you can, trying to, I guess, outsmart your body's own metabolism with numbers. And it may still not even be reflective of your needs. This is pretty frustrating. And there's almost two sides to this coin where some folks will say, well, Julian, of course it's calories in, calories out. This is thermodynamics. This is physics, right? But it's a very reductionistic idea of how physics works. Yes, there's the rule of thermodynamics, which works when we're thinking about a closed system that energy cannot be destroyed or created or something acts on something else. Yeah, those physics, of course, do exist. And also, that is taking a strong assumption that your body, the human body, is a reductionistic closed system, which it is not. There are a number of mechanisms, pulleys, and levers that are part of your metabolism, which moderate those things for you. And so I strongly suggest that we do look more towards those lifestyle interventions of changes which orient us towards quality of food and quality of our relationship with foods, as opposed to quantifying food through calories. I just think that the fact that these messages keep popping up over and over again, in spite of the heaps of evidence that they're not effective for most humans, is concerning. And that kind of goes on to part 2 of that. And problem number 5 is that they love to point out that most people don't follow the guidelines. And in my mind, it sounds like, well, it's your fault, right? That over individualizing responsibility. If I go back again to this language, I said it feels like there's something missing whenever they say that this requires, long-term lifestyle changes and support, is that there is zero language around the environment, our modern environment of food. There's zero language that around fast food and convenient food and junk food that's available on every corner and gas stations and on every major strip of street. That the food options that are most available and most marketed to us and are advertised every time we open up screens, which is almost always, that all these things are likely a detriment to our health over time instead of a positive benefit to our health. And so what I think that is missing in this language is like, yeah, maybe we should be thinking about some sort of changes to improve the quality of food which is available to most people. And I think in some extremes, you'll hear of this concept of food deserts, this idea that there are places where for miles in every direction, there is not even a grocery store where one could go to get healthy foods and healthy food options. Instead, their only options are fast food, right? And those are some extremes, but still, even when we have, I might have a grocery store within a mile of me, I'll still have a half dozen or more convenient fast food, junk food options between here and there. Doesn't help that I can get most of those delivered to my door without even having to go shopping myself. So I think that there needs to be some discussion or language around how the current food industry and all of its little sub-industries are regulated and how they are held in some ways responsible. Because if they're allowed to put as much, of an addictive and in the long term not good for us substance like sugar into their products as they want, and to make their products as appealing as they want and try to make them as addictive like as possible to continue to sell their product, then the people in general, and when you look at population sizes and you don't look at individuals, are the ones who are going to suffer the consequences. However, if you read the dietary guidelines, it seems like every once in a while they will say, well, if you just tried harder to follow the guidelines, you'd be healthier. It's if you would just burn some more calories and ate a few fewer calories, then this whole thing would be fine. I think that there is a message that each individual is, of course, responsible, and that's some idea of freedom, which is pervasive in Western culture, especially America. But I would love to see some more discourse around the responsibility of these big industries, which are the ones providing the food in the first place. I think that the current, BMI levels are going to continue to go up. And what was once an idea that only a minority of individuals were negatively impacted by junk food and fast food and the food environment in general is going to turn out that, like, oh, actually, when you take 9 out of 10 humans and you put them in an environment where most of the food options are low in quality and convenient and cheap, that most of them will have some sort of negative long-term consequence. That is not to say that individuals who are overweight or even obese cannot live fulfilling, long, healthy lives, right? But as it does indicate, it does increase the risk for certain chronic conditions, changes in function, disability, which could decrease a person's quality of life. These are all true things. And if, in my mind, if I'm thinking about the best ways to make impacts, is I want to have more healthy food options that are cheaper, that are more available than the ones which are currently driving our low quality food environment. So that is my soapbox for problem number 5, that there needs to just be more global general responsibility from the food providers who create the food environment that we live in our modern world. And sure, while individuals do need to step up and take some level of responsibility, it's like asking an individual to take responsibility for their thirst when they're in a desert. It's very difficult to, I guess, dig your own well or spend all your time searching for an oasis when the environment is just inherently dry and barren. And so it's maybe a little hyperbolic, but hopefully gets my point across. So those are my 5 problems with the American guidelines for 2020, 2025. And I imagine that as time passes, that there will still be some progressive steps. Again, most people following the standard American diet, the SAD diet, would likely benefit from following some of the recommendations that are in the 2020, 2025 guidelines. And also, if I'm thinking about making government sanctioned recommendations and guidelines that folks are going to follow and cite for the next 5 years, and technically 4 years at this point, then I'm going to want to provide the best evidence that I can. And sometimes it seems as though some of the best evidence and recommendations are fudged a little bit in order to make room for some industries and I guess political lobbies which have a lot of power. So those are just some things to think about as you're making some choices around your foods. And when people cite certain government sanctioned guidelines, how you can break some of this information down for yourself. I look forward to future conversations around nutrition, exercise, psychology, and the intersection of fitness psychology in general. I'll see you next time. Oh, wait. You still here? Oh, if you're still here, like, subscribe, comment even. I think those are things that help. I'm supposed to tell you to do that. So if you're still here, do those things. Okay.